I need to tell you something I've carried alone for 3 years, and even now, at 63, it's hard to say out loud. I spent that time living inside a marriage that looked beautiful from the outside, a retired woman who'd found love again, a tidy house in a quiet Ottawa neighborhood, a man the whole street admired. But inside that house, I was disappearing, piece by piece, day by day, until the morning I passed out on the kitchen floor and an ER nurse asked me one quiet question that broke something open in me I hadn't known was sealed shut. My name is Carol. I was a school librarian for 31 years in Halifax. When my husband David died of a stroke 4 years ago, after 38 years of marriage, I thought that was simply it for me. Our 2 children were grown, my daughter Sophie in Halifax and my son Matthew in Vancouver, and the house we'd shared on Jubilee Road felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I'd wake up and reach across the bed out of habit, and the cold emptiness of that side would remind me all over again. I wasn't looking for anyone. I want to be clear about that. A colleague's wife showed me an app called Stitch on her phone one afternoon. Not a dating app exactly, more of a social platform designed for people over 50 to find companionship, travel partners, friends. She thought it might help me stop spending every Saturday evening alone with a book and a cup of tea I didn't really taste. I made a profile mostly to prove I'd tried. That's how I met Gordon. He was 67, a retired civil engineer from Ottawa. His profile said he loved hiking the Gatineau Hills, cooking elaborate Sunday dinners, and watching his grandchildren play rep hockey. His photo showed a tall man with a trimmed silver beard and an open, easy smile. He sent me a message about a book I'd mentioned in my profile, The Stone Angel, by Margaret Lawrence. He said it was his mother's favorite novel and that he'd read it 3 times trying to understand her better. Something about that detail, the patience in it, made me write back. We messaged for 6 weeks before he suggested a phone call. We talked for 4 hours that first night. He told me about his marriage to his ex-wife Patricia, how she'd left him 8 years ago for a man she'd met at her office. He spoke about it without bitterness, or so I thought, just a quiet sadness, like a man who'd processed his grief and come out the other side intact. He spoke about his daughter in Canada and his 2 grandchildren with such warmth that I found myself pressing the phone closer to my ear just to hear him better. He never rushed me. When I talked about David, he didn't change the subject or grow uncomfortable. He just listened. He flew to Halifax to meet me in person after 2 months. He brought me a small jar of maple butter from a farm stand outside Almonte and said he'd heard Nova Scotians were particular about such things. I laughed at that. It was the first real laugh that had come out of me in a long time. We had dinner at a small restaurant on Barrington Street, and afterward we walked along the waterfront for an hour. He held the door. He asked questions. He remembered things I'd mentioned in passing weeks earlier, and brought them up naturally in conversation. By the time he flew home 2 days later, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again: hopeful. The courtship lasted almost a year. He drove the 12 hours to Halifax 4 more times. I flew to Ottawa twice, staying in a hotel, which he respected without complaint. He never made me feel pressured. He brought me flowers at the airport arrivals gate the second time I visited, and I stood there in the terminal thinking, I forgot this was even possible. Sophie met him at Christmas dinner and told me afterward she thought he seemed kind. Matthew, more cautious by nature, said he seemed like a solid person. "Just take your time, Mum," he said. I thought I had. Gordon proposed on a Saturday in March, standing in his kitchen in Ottawa while a pot of his homemade chicken soup simmered on the stove. It wasn't dramatic. He simply set down the wooden spoon, turned to me, and said he didn't want to spend whatever years he had left without me in them. I said yes. I was 61 years old, and I said yes. We married at the Ottawa courthouse in June, with Sophie, Matthew, and Gordon's daughter all present. We had dinner afterward at a restaurant on Elgin Street. It was small and warm and felt right. I sold my house in Halifax. The buyers were a young couple expecting their first baby, which felt like a good ending, and I moved into Gordon's home in the Glebe, a beautiful 1940s red brick house with a deep front porch and a backyard maple that turned to color in October. I can only describe as heartbreaking. We agreed to redecorate together. We'd make it ours. I should have noticed how every suggestion I made was quietly redirected. I loved warm colors, terracotta, deep green. Gordon preferred gray and white. More timeless, he said. Patricia always wanted everything bold, and it dated terribly. I told myself he had more experience with the house, that compromise was part of merging two lives. I chose my battles, as the expression goes, except I wasn't choosing them. I was forfeiting them without realizing the tally being kept. The first few months were largely fine. We cooked together on Sundays. We walked through Dow's Lake on weekend mornings. He knew everyone in the neighborhood and was warm with all of them, the retired couple next door, the young family across the street with the black lab he'd stopped to scratch behind the ears. I thought, this man is beloved by his community. That thought would come back to me differently later. The changes started so gradually I can only see them clearly in retrospect, looking back the way you look back at a road you've driven and realize you've been going the wrong direction for miles. I mentioned a watercolor class at the Ottawa School of Art. Not expensive, $120 for 8 weeks on Tuesday evenings. I'd always wanted to try. Gordon looked up from the laptop where he'd been checking his RRSP account and said, with perfect pleasantness, "Wouldn't that be a bit of a waste right now? We're trying to set up a proper household budget. Besides, Tuesday nights we usually watch our shows." I pointed out we had more than enough between his pension, my CPP, and the equity from my Halifax house sitting in my savings account. "It's not about the money," he said. "It's about priorities, Carol. I just thought we both agreed this year was about building something together, not running off to separate hobbies. I didn't sign up for the class. I told myself next session. There was no next session. That was February. By April, I'd stopped mentioning things I wanted. The Susan comparisons in the original story in my marriage, they were Patricia comparisons, except Gordon's version was more sophisticated, more insidious, because he never said Patricia was better. He said she was different, a distinction that put me in the impossible position of defending myself against a ghost I wasn't even allowed to be angry at. Patricia always managed the grocery run on Thursdays so the weekend was clear, he'd say, in a tone so casual it was impossible to object to. Or, standing in the kitchen watching me chop vegetables. Patricia had this method for stocks. She'd save all the trimmings in a bag in the freezer. Efficient, no waste. Or, on a Sunday when I'd suggested we drive out to see the tulips at Commissioner's Park, Patricia couldn't understand why I liked staying home on weekends either. That last one stopped me cold. I was being put in a category, the difficult wife who didn't appreciate stillness, and I hadn't done anything except suggest a 20-minute drive to look at tulips. I went anyway that day. Gordon said he had correspondence to catch up on. When I came home, he was sitting where I'd left him, but the atmosphere of the house had shifted in that way I was beginning to recognize. Not loud, never loud, just absent. He answered my description of the park in single syllables and went to bed early without saying goodnight. The silence was his primary instrument, and he played it with precision. Not anger, not shouting, just this withdrawal, this removal of warmth that left me feeling as though I'd committed some offense too obvious to name and too shameful to ask about. It would last days, sometimes 5, once 8. And in those silences I would move through the house watching myself from a small distance, trying to diagnose what I'd done wrong, cataloging my words and actions, looking for the error. I always apologized. I'm still not entirely sure what I was apologizing for. I stopped calling Sophie from inside the house. I'd wait until Gordon's Thursday afternoon walk 45 minutes, reliably, and use that window. I kept the calls short anyway. Sophie noticed. "Mum, you sound like you're reading from a script," she said once. "I'm just tired," I told her. "Are you happy there?" she asked. "Of course," I said. "Ottawa suits me." Neither of those things was true. My friend Diane from Halifax called one afternoon in October. We'd been friends since our children were in elementary school together. She was passing through Ottawa the following week and wanted to have lunch. I told her I'd love that. That evening I mentioned it to Gordon over dinner. He set down his fork. "Diane," he said, "the one who went through the divorce a few years ago?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, the way someone does when they're choosing their words carefully. "I just wonder if it's wise, Carol, surrounding yourself with people going through upheaval when we're still establishing our own routines. Divorce energy as it tends to spread. It's not judgment. I just care about what we're building here." He picked up his fork again. "But do what you want. You usually do." That last sentence, "you usually do," I turned it over for days. I wasn't doing what I wanted. I hadn't done what I wanted in months. I'd given up the art class, the Tuesday night book club I'd found through the Ottawa Public Library, the weekend drives, phone calls with my daughter. I was home every day preparing meals that were never quite right. Too much salt, not enough. Gordon had a specific method for everything, and my methods were always slightly wrong. I bought cookbooks. I watched videos online. I started keeping a small notebook of his preferences, as though I were a new employee studying the employee handbook. I canceled lunch with Diane. I told her something had come up. She called again a month later, and I let it go to voicemail. She sent a card at Christmas that I hid in the pocket of my winter coat so Gordon wouldn't see it and comment on the handwriting. Sophie flew to Ottawa in February to see me. I hadn't been back to Halifax since August. She took one look at me over our first cup of coffee and said, "Mom, you look exhausted." I laughed it off. She wasn't laughing. "How much weight have you lost?" I didn't know. I'd stopped looking in mirrors with any real attention. She stayed 3 days. Gordon was impeccably charming the entire time, taking us both to dinner at a restaurant on Bank Street, asking Sophie thoughtful questions about her work, insisting on paying. She texted me from the airport on her way home. "He seems great. But I'm worried about you. Please call me more." I read it in the upstairs bathroom with the door locked and then deleted it before I came back downstairs. The plate incident happened on a Friday morning in March. I was making eggs, and I reached across the counter for the pepper and knocked Gordon's coffee mug off the edge. It didn't break. It was a heavy ceramic mug. It just clattered on the tile and the coffee spread across the floor. I was already reaching for paper towels when Gordon, who had appeared in the doorway, said, "Really, Carol, every single morning it's something." I looked up. It was an accident. It's always an accident. You never pay attention. The mug, the cabinet door you leave open, the lights you leave on in every room. Patricia ran this house for 22 years, and I can count the things she broke on one hand. He walked to the table and sat down with his newspaper, leaving me on my knees cleaning up the coffee. Something in me cracked open. "Then maybe you should have married Patricia again," I said. My voice was very quiet. He looked at me over the paper. Then he stood up, walked to the counter, picked up the plate I'd set out for his eggs, and placed it, didn't throw, just placed it, with terrible, deliberate control face down on the tile. Eggs everywhere. He looked at me. "Clean that up," he said, "and don't speak to me like that again." He walked out of the kitchen. I heard the front door open and close. I sat on the kitchen floor and looked at the broken egg yolks spreading across the grout, and I thought, how long have I been here? When did I become this person who cleans up broken things on her knees and apologizes for accidents? But I cleaned it up. I cleaned everything up. I want to stop here and say something to anyone reading this who has already thought, why didn't she just leave? I would have left. I thought the same thing before this happened to me. I want you to understand something. By March of my second year in Ottawa, I had no local friends. I had distanced myself from my children. I had sold my house and spent the money on our joint household expenses. I had no professional life anymore. When I tried to imagine leaving, I couldn't picture where I would go. Back to Sophie's? A 62-year-old woman arriving on her daughter's doorstep to say, "My husband sets plates down on the floor and compares me to his ex-wife, and I'm not sure if that counts, because there were no bruises. He'd never touched me. He was beloved by the neighborhood. He coached a kids' hockey team for 20 years. I thought people would look at me and see a woman who couldn't manage her second marriage, who couldn't make her husband happy, who'd failed twice. I also, and this is the part that's hardest to admit, still loved parts of him. The man who'd talked about the stone angel on a first phone call, the man who'd driven 12 hours to see me. He was still in there, emerging on good days with enough warmth and wit to make me think, see, this is still possible. Try harder. That intermittent kindness kept me tied more effectively than anything else could have. The second major incident happened on a Thursday evening in late September. I'd spent the afternoon making a proper tourtière. Gordon had mentioned once that his mother used to make it and that he missed it. I'd called Sophie's Quebecois friend Adrienne for the recipe. I'd spent 3 hours on it. I'd set the table properly. I'd bought a bottle of Ontario Pinot Noir from the LCBO on Gladstone. Gordon came home 2 hours later. He hadn't called. He'd had dinner with a colleague from his former firm, he said, walking past me to hang his coat. Not hungry. Fine. A 3-hour tourtière. 3 hours. You could have texted, I said. He turned around slowly. Excuse me? I made dinner. I've been cooking all afternoon. You're doing it again. His voice had that particular quiet that made the back of my neck tighten. The moment I walked through the door. Do you know what it's like to deal with you after a long day? The immediate weight of your needs, your complaints. He gestured broadly at the set table, the candles, the untouched wine, and I felt the gesture was directed at me personally, at my neediness, at my embarrassing effort. All of this. Patricia never ambushed me. I'd come home and there'd be peace. You have never once given me peace. I made you dinner, I said. I was crying by then. I hated that I was crying. Don't you dare cry at me, he said. I have nothing to apologize for. I had a work dinner. It happens. Your inability to handle a single deviation from your schedule is not my responsibility. He took his coat back off the hook. I'm going for a walk. Don't wait up. He was gone for 2 hours. I sat at the table I'd set for two with the tourtière going cold, and I thought about what Lisa from my old book club used to say. She was a social worker. Before she retired, she used to say coercive control is the quietest form of violence there is. I'd nodded along when she said it. I'd thought I understood. I understood nothing then. I'd lost 15 pounds by November. My blood pressure, which I monitored at the Shoppers Drug Mart pharmacy on Bank Street on the Sundays Gordon golfed, had been climbing since the summer. I felt dizzy frequently, especially in the mornings. I was barely eating. Gordon's running commentary on my cooking had made mealtime something I wanted to escape rather than enjoy. I'd started picking at things, standing at the counter, rather than sitting down to eat properly. The morning it happened, it was a Monday in December. I was making oatmeal. Simple. Impossible to do wrong. Gordon was at the table reading the Globe on his tablet. I remember reaching for the brown sugar in the upper cabinet and then nothing. Just the floor, coming up fast, then the ceiling. Then Gordon's face above me, pale and entirely unlike itself, stripped of everything usual and just frightened. Carol. Carol, can you hear me? Don't move. Don't move, I'm calling. He called 911. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. I remember being aware of being moved, of bright cold air, of the particular smell of the ambulance. At the Ottawa Civic Hospital, they took blood, did an ECG, took my blood pressure, which was dangerously high. They asked Gordon questions and he answered them. He'd been a concerned and attentive husband, he said. But I'd been under a lot of stress lately. He didn't know why. He was very worried about her. She hadn't seemed herself for months. He said this while holding my hand in a way that felt proprietary rather than comforting. The nurse assigned to my bay was a woman in her late 40s named Bridget. She had a calm, efficient manner and a small silver hummingbird pinned to her lanyard. After she'd taken my vitals for the 3rd time and adjusted my IV, she looked at the door, which was closed, and moved her chair slightly closer to the bed. Carol, she said, your husband has stepped out to call your daughter. I'd like to ask you something, and I need you to take a breath before you answer. She paused. Are you safe at home? I opened my mouth to say yes. Of course. Don't be silly. Of course I'm safe. What came out was a sound I didn't recognize as coming from myself. Not words. Just 3 years of swallowed words, arriving all at once, as air. Bridget handed me a tissue box without saying anything. She sat with me while I cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry in years. She didn't rush. She didn't look at her watch. She just waited, and when I started to be able to speak, she listened. He'd never hit, I said. He makes me feel like nothing I do is right. He won't speak to me for days when he's angry. He compares me constantly to his ex-wife. He's isolated me from my friends, from my children. And 2 months ago I stopped. 2 months ago? She prompted gently. I told her about the tourtière evening. About the way he'd looked at the table I'd set like it was evidence of my pathology. About the walk home at midnight, the silence for 4 days afterward, the apology I'd given for asking him to call if he was going to be late. Bridget nodded. Carol, what you're describing is emotional abuse, specifically what we'd call coercive control. It often escalates over time. The physical component, if it comes, typically comes after patterns like the ones you're describing have been established. She paused. You're severely dehydrated and your blood pressure is at a level we'd consider a hypertensive crisis. You're going to stay here tonight. She touched my hand briefly. "While you're here, I'm going to have our social worker on call come speak with you. Her name is Priya. That's entirely your choice, but I want you to know she's available." I said yes. I would like to speak with her. Gordon came back in 20 minutes later with news that Sophie was driving from Halifax and would be here by morning. He was solicitous, pressing. He sat beside the bed and kept his hand on the arm the IV wasn't in. He spoke to the doctor about my stress levels, my eating, his worry. I watched him perform concern, and I felt something I can only describe as the scales leveling. Not anger, exactly. Clarity. Priya came to see me after Gordon went down to the cafeteria for dinner. She was direct and warm in equal measure, which is the combination I needed. She put pamphlets on the tray table, the Assaulted Women's Helpline card, information about Interval House Ottawa, and she walked me through what a safety plan looked like. She said, "You don't have to decide anything tonight, but I want you to think about what your life could look like versus what it currently looks like, not what Gordon wants it to look like, what you want." Lying in that hospital bed after she left, I let myself think about it for the first time in years without immediately suppressing the thought. I wanted to call Sophie without listening for Gordon's footsteps on the stairs. I wanted to meet Diane for lunch in Halifax without engineering a reason. I wanted to take the watercolor class at the Ottawa School of Art that started every January, which I had looked up online privately and never registered for 2 consecutive years. I wanted to cook things that were mine, eat them without commentary, leave cabinet doors open if I forgot to close them. I wanted to stop being afraid of the quality of silence in my own house. I wanted to be Carol again, not Gordon's slightly inadequate version of what Carol should be. I was discharged the following afternoon. Sophie had arrived by morning, and sitting across from her in the hospital room watching her take in my thinned-out face and the IV marks on my arm and something she clearly saw in my eyes, she didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she reached across and took both my hands. "Mum," she said, "tell me what's been happening." I told her everything. 2.5 hours, beginning to end. She cried at some points and went very still at others. When I finished, she said, "You're coming home with me." And I said, "It's not that simple." And she said, "Yes, it is. I'll figure out the not simple parts. You just need to say yes." We called Matthew from the parking garage of the hospital where Gordon couldn't hear. Matthew had never liked Gordon. He'd kept it to himself out of respect for me, but he said it plainly now, calm and clear the way he gets when things are serious. He said he'd take emergency leave and fly to Ottawa by Friday. "Don't go back alone," he said. "Promise me." I promised him. Gordon came to pick me up from the hospital with a card he'd bought at the gift shop downstairs. It said "Get well soon" with a photograph of yellow tulips on it, and he'd written inside, "Looking forward to having you home. The house isn't itself without you." He said this with Sophie sitting right there, who said nothing but whose hand found mine and held it. When we got back to the house in the Glebe, Gordon was his most charming, most attentive version, helping me to the sofa, making tea, asking every 15 minutes if I needed anything. Sophie sat in the living room with us and watched him with an expression she kept carefully neutral. That night she slept in the guest room. I lay awake in our bedroom listening to Gordon's steady breathing and thinking about what Priya had said. "What do you want your life to look like?" Matthew arrived Thursday. Saturday, Gordon had his weekly volunteer shift, coaching the youth hockey clinic at the arena on Woodruff 3 hours, reliable as the tide. The 4 of us had planned it to the minute. Sophie and Matthew helped me pack 2 suitcases with my clothes, my medications, my health card, my SIN card, my Nova Scotia driver's license, the folder where I kept my banking information, my laptop. We worked quickly and quietly, the 3 of us moving through the house with a focus I can only describe as surgical. I took the copy of The Stone Angel from the bookshelf, my copy, which I'd brought from Halifax, and I left everything else. I wrote a note and left it on the kitchen table. "Gordon, I'm leaving this marriage. My lawyer will contact you. Please do not call me or come to my daughter's address." I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. I walked out of that house and got into Matthew's rental car, and Sophie drove, and I didn't look back at the red brick or the front porch or the maple in the backyard. We were on the 417 heading east before I felt like I could breathe properly. The next 8 months were not simple, just as I'd known they wouldn't be. Gordon called my cell phone 17 times in the first 2 days before Matthew arranged with our lawyer to send a formal letter requesting no contact. He called Sophie. He appeared at my youngest grandchild's hockey game in Halifax. How he knew to be there I've never fully understood, and Sophie had to ask the rink manager to intervene. His daughter called me once, not unkindly, saying she hoped I was all right and that her father was really struggling. I wished her well and hung up. The divorce took 9 months. Gordon contested the division of assets aggressively. He had a lawyer who argued I had contributed to the breakdown of the marriage through emotional withdrawal, a claim my lawyer dismantled methodically, with Bridget the nurse's documentation of my hospital admission and Priya the social worker's notes about our conversation, which I had signed a release to allow. The judge was a woman in her 60s, and she looked at the documentation with an expression I couldn't read, but she ruled in my favor on every substantive point. I received my proportional share of the marital assets, which with the equity from my Halifax house restored to me, left me financially stable. Gordon's community standing in the Glebe didn't survive entirely intact. I'd said nothing publicly, but these things have a way of surfacing. His daughter reached out 6 months after the divorce was finalized, not to advocate for him this time, but to say she'd been doing some thinking about her own childhood and that she was sorry I'd experienced what I had. I thanked her for saying so. I'm 63 now. I live in a small, bright apartment on Quinpool Road in Halifax, 10 minutes from Sophie and 12 minutes from Emma and Liam's school, where I pick them up on Tuesdays. Matthew flew in for my birthday in June, and we spent the day hiking out at Peggy's Cove and eating fish and chips in the wind like we did when the kids were small. I cried driving home, not from sadness, from the specific relief of a life that is simply mine again. I take the watercolor class. I'm not particularly gifted, but my instructor says I have a good instinct for color, which I've decided is enough. I had lunch with Diane last month and we talked for 4 hours without once, not once, keeping one ear tuned to the sound of a car in the driveway. I still have nights where I go over it looking for the version of events where I did something differently early on and it all went another way. I've learned, in therapy, to let those thoughts move through without grabbing onto them. My counselor at the Women's Center says that abusers like Gordon are extraordinarily skilled at disguising what they are in the beginning, that the care he showed in those early months was real, or at least real enough that I couldn't have easily seen through it. The love bombing, she calls it. It's not a phase they grow out of. It's a phase that ends when they feel secure enough to begin the other phase. And I had no way to know that in a Halifax airport arrivals hall holding a small jar of maple butter. If you are reading this and something in it is familiar, not identical, maybe, but familiar, I want to say to you directly, you are not crazy. You are not too sensitive. You are not the problem that needs solving. What you may be is a person who has been very gradually and very deliberately taught to doubt your own perception of reality, which is one of the most disorienting things one human being can do to another. Emotional abuse leaves no bruises you can photograph. It leaves marks in other places in your appetite, in your blood pressure, in the way you apologize reflexively for things that aren't your fault, in the way you measure the temperature of a room the moment someone enters it. Those marks are real. What you experienced is real. In Canada, if you need to speak with someone, the Assaulted Women's Helpline is available at 1-866-863-0511, 24 hours a day, in over 200 languages. ShelterSafe at sheltersafe.ca can help you locate women's shelters and transition houses in your province. If you are in immediate danger, please call 911. These resources exist because what is happening to you counts. Because you count. Your doctor can help you. If you have a moment alone at an appointment as I did, though mine came unexpectedly in an emergency room, tell them. They are trained to hear it. A good one will ask you the right question, and when they do, you don't have to protect anyone except yourself. I know the reasons to stay feel bigger than the reasons to leave. I know the future looks blank and terrifying from inside that house. I know the person you married is still in there sometimes, appearing just long enough to make you question your own memory of the bad days. I know all of that. I lived inside it for 3 years. I also know what it feels like to drive east on a highway with your children and leave a door closed behind you for the last time. It feels like the first full breath in years. You are not trapped. You are stronger than he has spent a long time convincing you that you are. And there is an entire life on the other side of that door, imperfect and your own, which is the only kind worth living.